So we're explaining the meaning of Cyrus. Why is it in some situations, thank you, Cyrus is considered a positive thing. In some situations, Cyrus is considered a negative thing. And the answer is Cyrus down here in this physical world have their roots in the spiritual realm. So in the spiritual realm, there's also Cyrus. There's Cyrus in Atika Kadisha, and there's Cyrus in the sphere of Malchus. And whatever goes on down here has an effect up there. So therefore, based on this, we can understand why sometimes Cyrus is positive, one time Cyrus is negative. And he explained that the Cyrus of Atika Kadisha is a positive thing, because Atika Kadisha is, good morning, Ein Sof. It's the infinite light of Hashem. And this infinite light of Hashem provides life and sustenance to all the worlds. But in order to provide life and sustenance to all the worlds, this light, which is Ein Sof, infinite, has to go through Tzimtzum, but not an ordinary Tzimtzum, has to go through a Tzimtzum, which is Cyrus, which means an excessive Tzimtzum, a very strong Tzimtzum, very unusual Tzimtzum. That means that a Nazir or Mitzvah or anyone down here where the Torah says, do not cut the hair is something holy. That means that in those circumstances, their hair is connected to the Cyrus in Atika Kadisha. And if the person cuts his hair in this world, it basically eliminates it up there in that world. And being that over there it's necessary, and without that, the chayas, the sustenance can't come from Ein Sof, from infinite to finite. So by cutting the hair, you're causing damage to all the worlds. On the other hand, there are certain situations which the hair in this world, its counterpart up there is Malchus, the hair of Malchus, which means when Malchus goes through excessive tzimtzum, that's something which needs more caution. Why? Because Malchus is the 10th sphere, and the light in Malchus is already a light that has been diminished and hidden and concealed. And that's in fact why Malchus could be the source of the next world, because the light in Malchus is already in a process of tzimtzum. To add to that, excessive tzimtzum like hair, which means that now the tzimtzum is really out of the ordinary, you need tremendous caution that this light should only go to Kedusha and not to Klippa. As long as the light is exposed and opened, then Klippa can't receive it. But once it becomes hidden, especially to a certain degree, then Klippa could receive it. So that means that in a situation down here, in this physical world, where the hair is connected to Malchus, which the example of that is a married woman's hair, why does it have to be covered? Because down here is connected to the hair in Shamayim, in Malchus. And if it's going to be exposed and uncovered and not sort of cautioned, then up there it'll give chayus to Klippa. Like I explained last time, the reasons we give, which are more logical reasons, not spiritual reasons. The logical reason is that the Torah views hair as other private parts of a woman's body, and therefore it could cause behavior which is not tznius. It's another way of saying that if the hair is exposed, it'll lead to undesirable results. Why? Because up there, it'll give chayas to Klippa. Down here, it'll manifest in things happening which are not tznius. We're up to the part we started to give a mashal and explain. Based on what the Gemara says, that Talmidei Chachamim, great Torah scholars, brilliant Torah scholars and great tzaddikim, even their casual conversations are Torah. In other words, because they are themselves filled with so much Torah and on such a high level, then even that which sort of is the overflow is also, has tremendous depth to it and tremendous wisdom to it. And that's why the Gemara says that the casual conversation of a Talmid Chacham needs to be studied like any other thing in Torah. On the other hand, if it's an ordinary person who doesn't have that tremendous depth and wealth of Torah knowledge, an ordinary person, and then he speaks ordinary, casual conversation, that's something which is basically empty. And therefore, it's something which is negative, according to Torah, for a man to engage in dvarim b'teilim, idle talk.
Rabbi Majeski, which page are we on?
So, we're going to start now from the last line on page 116. So this is a Sefer Derech Mitzvah Sefer of the Tzemach Tzedek. Mitzvah Tegalachas Mitzera, and page 116. Behind this means, it's the last line on the bottom. Even if we're talking about a person who is a Adam Kosher, means he's a proper individual who observes Torah, observes mitzvahs, is a Torah scholar. We're not talking about somebody who is just an ordinary person. Yes, he's also a Torah scholar. But Mikol Mokem, page 119, Mikol Mokem, Ein Boy Choch Mikol Kach. He's not on that level that he's so much filled with deep wisdom to say that even his idle talk also has words of Torah. But in his case, as sichas chulin, which is the ordinary conversation, that's really idle talk. There's nothing there. So when he speaks words of Torah, he's in a good place. But what comes out as the excess sort of wisdom that comes, or excess conversation that comes out of his wisdom, that's called Meisra Meichen. It's excess intellectual energy. That's empty because it's nothing. It's nothing compared to what goes on in his head. But what goes on in his head is worth, it's like, it's interesting. The Gemara says, just using as an example, that how did Moshe Rabbeinu become wealthy? Anyone know? You might find out the technique and we can do the same thing. No, you can't. The Gemara says that the luchis of the Ten Commandments wasn't an ordinary stone. It was a sapphire stone. A little sapphire stone, this small, could be cost thousands of dollars. Imagine something so big that had all the 10 the Seres HaDibros in it. So the words of Hashem were engraved in the stone. So there was, what would you call it? Sawdust. I guess this would be stone dust. There's dust that falls. It's the fallout of drilling a hole in the luchas and making words out of it. So Hashem said to Moshe, you can keep the dust, and the dust alone was worth millions of dollars or whatever in those days the money, whatever the money was, and therefore that's how we got rich. What did he do with it? I don't know. It's interesting that people, I don't know where the source is, that this is one of the sources why we give a shatchan money for shatchanas. Moshe Rabbeinu was the shatchan between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. Hashem is the chosen, we're the kala. Who put us together? Moshe Rabbeinu. So Hashem said, okay, here's your shatchanas money. So we're talking about sawdust. Good morning. If you do the same thing with a piece of wood, you do the same thing with the ordinary stone. The ordinary stone is worth something. It's a rock. You can do something with it. The dust is dust. It's worthless. But if it's dust of something which, to begin with, is worth millions and millions of dollars, then even the dust is also worth a lot. Think of it that way. If a person is filled with a tremendous amount of depth of godly wisdom, then even what comes out of his mouth, as if it's casual, it's not so simple. It also has tremendous depth to it. But someone who, l'chatchila, his level of depth is average, regular, not a bad person, a good person, but not this level of depth. So the things that just come out of his mouth as a casual conversation is really nothing but a casual conversation. Let's look at another line. Mashakosa b'Zohar. It says in the Zohar, Rav Hamnuna Saba. Rav Hamnuna Saba was one of the greatest sages in his times. In fact, he was one of the exceptional individuals who studied Kabbalah and taught Kabbalah. Rav Hamnuna Sana, before he taught, he would make some humorous remark to his students. Before he began saying wisdom, he said something which is sort of a humorous remark. It sounded like a joke. But the word that he uses in Aramaic, if you notice, pirka is like the Hebrew word perik, which means a chapter. Shtusa is like the Hebrew word shtus, which means foolishness or silliness. Ve'enu pirka the shtusa. Einam shtusa mamash chas v'sholem. It doesn't mean chas v'sholem that he said things which were nonsense. Kiyim, what does it mean? Page 118. P'chinas neivles chochmah. It means this was the overflow. This was sort of the excess of his chokhmah. Just like we said before, the sichas chulin of Talmidei Chachamim. Like it's known that the Rebbe Marash would very often say things in a humorous way. We'd only find that by the Rebbe Marash. In our generation, we saw this by the Rebbe as well. But the Alter Rebbe, the Mitter Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Rashab, even the Frierdiker Rebbe, we didn't find this as a common thing. But the Rebbe Marash, it was known that he would say things very often in a humorous way. One time, he told a certain chassid to do something. And later, when he saw the chassid again, he said, how come you didn't do what I told you to do? So he said, I'm sorry, I thought the Rebbe was joking. So the Rebbe Marash said, I never made a joke in my entire life. So what was all those humorous statements? They weren't jokes, chas v'sholem. They were deep wisdom that was presented in a humorous way. And that's what he's saying here. We find a similar thing in Gemara, and this you might remember from Tanya, the beginning of Tanya. Rabbi, the famous sage Rabbi, he also, every lesson, he would open up with a humorous statement. The sages would laugh. The basar possible shmais, then they started to teach. Today, a lot of speakers have that also. They tell a joke, it has nothing to do with the content of the speech, but it's a joke. Everybody laughs, and he starts to think. But it says about Rabbi, and probably the same with Rav Hamnuna Saba. Why do they do that? Because these sages were such great tzaddikim, and people who sat in front of them listening to their shir were in such awe that they couldn't even concentrate on what he was saying because they were so full of fear and awe sitting in front of these giants. So he wanted to do something they should be more relaxed and be more open to be able to listen and absorb what he has to say. So he would say something humorous, they relaxed, and then he would start his shir. So as an example, the famous story, which we happen to talk about in this class for a different reason, but the famous story was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi that he was teaching the students, and he saw that they were sort of falling asleep, like that, or they were literally falling asleep and snoring, but it probably means they were not as alert as they should have been. And he said to them, the women in Mitzrayim gave birth to 6 babies at once, but there was one woman, she had 600,000 babies in one shot. Who was she? And they all perked up 600,000 babies in one shot. And then he told them it's Moshe Rabbeinu. So the truth is, there's tremendous wisdom in this idea that Moshe Rabbeinu represents all the Yidden, that Moshe Rabbeinu includes all the Yidden, but the way he gave it over to them was in a way which sounded like something humorous, and something interesting, and something intriguing, and that's why they woke up. And that's what it means when they said Muslim or something like that. So we come back to the same point, that these are great tzaddikim, that tremendous depth in their wisdom, and therefore whatever came out of their mouth, even if it sounded like a casual statement or conversation, it was also filled with tremendous depth. But if an ordinary person would tell these kind of jokes, then it's just a joke, nothing more than just a joke, and there's no real depth to it. And now he goes to explain it deeper. To understand this matter deeper, Understand, how come there has to be Hashpah Megdusha Yenin Datikra Kadisha Desires Dapka? Why the sustenance and the flow of life and energy that's coming from Atikra Kadisha, why does it have to go through Cyrus? It's necessary. Well, the Zeus, and that's why Ikra Kedusha Toli Behem. And he's explaining the question. This the mashal we're giving with the Talmud Chacham and his casual conversation doesn't really do justice, doesn't answer this question. Why? Let's think a moment for the mashal. There's a Talmud Chacham, he has tremendous wisdom, and his casual conversation also has wisdom. It's true. That even his casual conversation needs to be studied like any other part of Torah. But isn't it true that when he teaches Torah, straight Torah, there's much more wisdom and much more benefit in that than the casual conversation? So what do you need the casual conversation for? Let him just teach Torah and give over deep wisdom, not something which is relatively external. The same question we can ask about what's going on Lamaila. I think you know the answer because I already explained it, but I know it from here. So, but initially he's asking, we're giving a mashal that's something very high. Even the Cyrus is also very high. But why do you need it for in the first place? Wouldn't it be better to take the words of wisdom from the Talmud Chacham, not his casual conversation, but that the shir itself, the Torah teachings itself? And here too, why does Hashem make that that this flow of sustenance has to go and be transmitted dafka through the tzimtzum of Cyrus? True, the Cyrus, even though it's tzimtzum, it's still very, very high because it comes from a very high, infinite place. But wouldn't it be better if the Hashpah would come directly from Atika Kadisha without the Cyrus? So a little bit we already explained. Atika Kadisha page 120. Atika Kadisha, as it is, without going through a process of tzimtzum, the spiritual world cannot receive their sustenance, cannot receive their nurture from that level because it's infinite. And therefore, it has to go through the Cyrus. And we can explain this with the concept of a mashal and a nimshal. So now is another explanation. It says, a reference to Shlomo Melech, it said that he spoke 3,000 mishalim, 3,000 analogies. Reb Meir says something similar about Reb Meir. Mishames Reb Meir, Batlu Moshli Mishalim. Once Reb Meir passed away, then so with him was the end of an era. Which era? The era of those that say Mishalim. Want to ask something? Because you have a different book, probably, no? Right. Is that Mitzorah? What does it say on the front cover? It is the right book, right? On the top, you look at the numbers on the top or over here. There's a Gemara where the Gemara says that certain sages, when they passed away, that was the end of an era. This was the end of an era of this. This was the end of the era of that. Like, for example, the Gemara says, up until a certain point, when people studied Torah out of respect for Torah, they only stood. There wasn't such a thing as sitting and studying Torah. So like in Shul, when they take the Torah out, everybody stands up. And some people even stand while they're reading the Torah. So there was a time where not just the Torah, anything a person studied from Torah, they would only study standing. And then when this and this sage passed away, that was the end of that era. In other words, That was the last person who gave the generation strength to live up to those standards. And after they passed away, the standards became lower. One of the examples is Rabbi Meir. The Gemara says, up until Rabbi Meir, there were people who would give mishalim, analogies. Once Rabbi Meir was nostalgic, once he passed away, that was the end of the era. And Rabbi Meir himself, he was not just that he was able to give an analogy, but he taught 300 mishalim. That's what the Gemara says. So on the surface, it seems to be that Shlomo Melech, who was so much, he was the smartest person in the world, he gave 3,000 mishalim, and Rabbi Meir gave 300 mishalim. And by the way, what does it mean? This class itself, we gave out so many mishalim already. What does it mean? The era of mishalim is ended. You can give a mashal. You're going to teach someone, and they don't understand, and you want to explain with a mashal, I'm sure you'll be able to think of a good mashal. So how could you say that when Rabbi Meir passed away, the era of mishalim was ended? So we're not talking about a mashal, the kind of mashal that we give. That's a mashal that we try to look for an example, something similar. These were mishalim that they embodied in them, they contained in them all the depth of the wisdom of the teacher of Torah. And the wisdom was so deep and so abstract that the only way they can explain it is through a mashal. So I want to explain what that means. Even without a mashal, if a person understands something very deep, wants to explain it to someone who's not on their level, they don't need a mashal. They try to explain it in a simpler language. They simplify it. They speak in a language that they could relate to and they could understand. And that's the way they can transmit what's in their head to the other person. A mashal is only when something is so deep and so abstract that no matter how much you try to simplify it, how much you try to make it understood, there's no way in the world that the recipient could get it. And therefore, the only thing you can do, the only way you can transmit it is through a mashal. So I'll give you a mashal for that. What would be the mashal? For example, this itself, what we're learning now, could you explain this to a 5-year-old? What if you explain it in very simple words? There's no way you can explain it to a 5-year-old. No matter what words you use, what language you use, even if you would be like brilliant in words, you still wouldn't be able to. It's impossible. The concept is too abstract for a child. So the only way to explain it, if you do want to give it over to the child, is to explain it in a way that, what's a mashal? A mashal means something. Mashal could very often be like a story, stories that you have in Chazal. And this mashal contains a certain idea. The story a little child can understand. And in that story, even though they don't get it, but in the story, all the wisdom is there. And as they get older, they'll look at the story again, and they'll analyze the story, and they'll realize this detail, that detail, and how much wisdom is there. So here with Rabbi Meir, I really should have looked it up before the class. Too late now. But anyway, it says Rabbi Meir said 300 mishalim, and the Gemara says, and that we only know 3 of his mishalim. So I want to give you an example. What's a mashal? The mashal the Gemara gives is, and the 2 of them that I remember is with a fox. So one of the mishalim is there was a fox who looked down in a well, and he saw something white in the water. He got very excited. It looked like it tastes good. What was it? It was a reflection of the moon. But the fox thought it was some delicious food. So he jumped into the bucket and he went straight down into the water. When he came down to the water, he was shocked and disappointed to find there's nothing there more than water. But now he's stuck. He can't get out. It's too deep. After being there for a few hours, another animal comes by and sticks his head over the water and says to the fox, "What's down there?" So the fox says, "You see this white thing? You have no idea how delicious it is. This is something you never tasted anything like this in your entire life." So the other animal says, "So how can I get it?" So he says, jump in the other bucket. You know how they used to work with a bucket? One was down and one was up. Jump in the other bucket that's on top of the well, and you'll be able to come down. So the other animal jumps in the bucket, goes down, and he's in this bucket, so he goes up. He jumps out of the bucket, and goodbye. This is a story. But the Gemara says there's tremendous wisdom in this story. And I know there's a mimer from the Rebbe somewhere where the Rebbe explains something about the story, why a fox and why a bucket and why a water and why a well. So a story is something which you don't even see the wisdom there. It's just a story. And anyone can understand it. So that's how Reb Meir, his brain was so, that's what it means, Mashalim, that there were people that understood things so deep that even to great scholars and to great students, they could not explain what they understood unless they used the mushroom. So the Gemara says, after a mayor, we didn't have people on that deep level that the only way they can transmit is through a mushroom. The only problem is that Rameir was so deep that even his mushal couldn't be understood. So he needed a mushal for the mushal. And then the mushal for the mushal couldn't be understood. So he needed 300 mashal. Not that during his lifetime, he made up 300 little stories. It means everything that he learned and understood, he needed 300 mashalim to bring it down to the level of his students. We can't even begin to understand what kind of wisdom that is. What does that mean? But I'll give you an example of a mushal for a mushal. Or unless someone here wants to give me an example of a mushal for a mushal.
Take it away, Rob.
Take it away. Okay. Here we go. Fasten your seatbelts. No, it's not so. It's very simple. When we want to explain in the Chassidus the difference between the sphere of Chochmah, Bina, Das, which is the intellectual spheres, and the emotional spheres, what do we use to explain it? How do we explain it? We use the example of intellect and emotion in a person. Is the intellect and emotion of Hashem the same as the intellect and emotion in a person? So what is it? It's mushal. Intellect of Hashem is something totally different than the intellect in a person. The emotion, when we talk about Hashem and Chesed and Gevura, those spheres are infinitely different and greater than our emotion. There's a similarity on some level because this Gashmizdika intellect and emotion comes from the spiritual intellect and emotion. But in essence, you can't even compare the two. Like someplace in Chassidus, it gives a mashal of sweetness. An apple is sweet, right? If it's sweet, where does it come from? Which sphere is sweetness? Chesed. But do you think chesed has the sweetness of an apple? Now, sweetness of an apple is something you can taste in your mouth with taste. So, for example, there's sweetness in music. It's also sweetness, but it's not the same sweetness as an apple. There's sweetness in seichel sometimes. Something is so deep, so beautiful that you can use a term of sweetness, but it's a different kind of sweetness. So it's all sweet, and the same thing, chesed of Atzilus is a whole different kind of sweetness. But we still use the same term because this evolves from that. So when we want to explain something about Hashem's intellect and Hashem's emotion, and what we use to explain is the intellect and emotion of a human, that's a mushal. Agree? Disagree? Yeah. But how can I explain intellect and emotion? How they interact with each other? Or the differences between them. Sometimes I need a mushal to explain that. And let's say we use a mushal, the difference between fire and water. How intellect is like water and emotion is like fire, and we explain a certain idea. So basically what we're doing is we have a mushal, which is intellect and emotion, and then we use fire and water as a mushal for the mushal, which is really a mushal for something higher about Hashem. So you have 3 mashalim stages.
What was it?
One is Hashem's intellect and emotion. The other is human intellect and emotion. And the third would be the difference between fire and water, which in many ways the nature of fire is like intellect, and the of water is like intellect, and fire is like emotion. In what way? Again, there's many different ways that it's brought out, but there are mishalim and chassidus, how fire, for example, takes things apart, and intellect brings things together, and I mean water brings things together, whether it's water that you put into cement or water that you put into flour. What the water does, it brings everything together. And that's similar to the difference between intellect and emotion in a certain aspect of it. So not to go into the details, because that's not what we're aiming at right now, but just an example of how you have a mushal for a certain concept. This concept needs a mushal, and a mushal needs another mushal. A Chochmah Bina, very often. You want to explain Chochmah Bina in the spiritual spheres, you use Chochmah Bina of the human intellect. And again, Chochmah Bina, human intellect, is fire and water. Water brings all the details together, and fire takes all the details apart. And there's other similarity between the nature of fire and the nature of Bina, the nature of water and the nature of Chochmah. And that's only a mashal for Hashem's Chochmah and Bina. And then we can begin to appreciate the greatness of Shlomo HaMelech, that he was so deep that he needed 3,000 levels of Mishalim to explain one concept. Because he understood such depths, the real hidden secrets in the Torah, there was no way they can understand the true depth of their wisdom. Elam Kain, they had to give a mashal. And what's a mashal? When you give a mashal, you're hiding the real deep wisdom. In something, there's a similarity to that wisdom, but it's not the wisdom itself in its purest form. By understanding this analogy, it's tired Talmud shemitz once you understand the analogy, you can get a little bit of a trace of the wisdom that's in the heart of the student. Yeah.
Why is it in the heart of the student, not the mind of the student?
It's a good question. But I think it has to do with the fact that when we talk about wisdom, that it's able to be internalized and understood and really absorbed, we use the term the heart. That means it really penetrated. In fact, if you look in Pasach Aliyahu, that's the part of the Zohar we had in the Maimer before, where it lists all the 10 spheres. So when it comes to Bina, it says Bina Liba. Bina is in the heart. But it means that it's the heart that grasps the concept, internalizes the concept.
Thank you.
Yep. I once heard a little mashal, and later I discovered that the Rebbe once told some of this mashal. I knew the mashal, I didn't even know it had a source in Torah, but the Rebbe used this mashal. And I remember once telling it to someone regarding Shalom Bayis or whatever. And it's years later, it's almost 30 years later, they tell me every time I think of this mashal, it's put me into place. What was the mashal? It's a famous little story that you might have read when you were young in your third grade reader, maybe. But the mashal is, this is the way the story goes, but you can make the story whichever way you want. That the wind and the sun were having an argument, who's stronger? And the wind said, I'm stronger. So somebody was walking down the road with a coat, and the wind said, watch me blow the coat off. He started to blow, and the person who sees the wind blowing, all of a sudden he holds on to his coat. the wind blows stronger, so he tightens his coat. Even stronger, so he ties a belt around its coat. And now, no matter how much you blow, it doesn't go up. So the sun said, okay, now let me try. The sun starts shining, it starts getting hot, he unbuttons the coat, gets even hotter, he takes off the belt, gets even hotter, he takes it off, and he can't wear it anymore. What's the mashal? The mashal is that when you try to make someone change through wind, like with force, the opposite may happen, that the person will resist the force and actually make an effort not to let you influence them. But if it's done with love and in a gentle way and in a smiley way, it's going to accomplish much more. So it's a little story. If you tell a story to a child, a young child, you won't even get what the nimshal behind it is. You want to apply it to life. And when you do apply it, there's probably many levels of how this could be applied and could be understood. It could be applied to how I have influence on another person. And it could also be applied to how I have influence on myself, my own character traits, and so on. You know, it's more about the concept of positive reinforcement rather than trying to uproot something which is negative with force. So after there's a mashal, then the student has some idea in his head. What he understands is still not the real deal, but he has an idea now of the deeper thing. And being that the wisdom here is something so deep, so even the example is too deep. That's where Rabbi Meir needed a mashal to explain the mashal. In other words, it's an example to get a better understanding of the first example. And then Shlomo HaMelech, who was much greater than that in wisdom, he was the wisest person that ever lived. He needed 3,000 mishalim, which means a mashal to a mashal to a mashal. Only that way could he bring down the real depth of his understanding. One descent after another, from one mashal to another mashal, the dugma achrayna, and the last final mashal. That's what he was able to give to the people. They should be able to understand it. Rabbi Meir, who wasn't as deep as Shlomo Melech, for him, 300 mishalim was enough. 300 levels was enough. If you would compare the mashal compared to the nimshal is the concept that's being taught. It's a very coarse garment. It's like a garment. It's like, imagine a glove. The glove is shaped the way my hand is. This finger is smaller, this finger is this shape, and the thumb goes like this. It's a glove, but you can't compare a glove to a hand. This is a human hand, and this is a garment. So that's how a mashal, even though it fits the nimshal, explains the nimshal, everything is true, but the mashal is still a thick garment compared to the nimshal. So he says, in essence, this is what hair is all about. There's a certain energy which comes in the brain, and he's speaking here on a physical, I think, physical, biological level. There's something that is transmitted through the hair. And in fact, the hair inside is hollow, and it goes through that hollow part of the hair. That's what it says in Gemara Nazir, Perikama de Baba Basra, by So this analogy is called excess intellectual energy, which means that energy of the brain that comes into the hair is nothing compared to the intellectual energy. So therefore, when you talk about very great sages like Shlomo Melech, Rabbi Meir, even the excess of their intelligence, which is the mashal, there was tremendous benefit from it, tremendous kedusha to it, and tremendous wisdom to it. gadol. They had a tremendous need. They had to be that way. They'll adam without the mashal, they wouldn't be able to communicate their wisdom to others. They don't need mashalim. Like the Gemara says, but l'meisha mashalim. He's going to explain when someone doesn't need a mashal, then not only the mashal doesn't help, the mashal actually disturbs and interferes. The mashal for that would be that if a person wears a garment that's longer than what their size. So somebody might say, if it's longer, it means there's more material than I need. What could go wrong? But if you wear something that's longer than your size, you'll trip over it, you can fall, and you can get hurt. So levush, a garment, has to be measured and in proportion to what it's covering. So therefore, if it's a big chacham and he gives a mashal, yes. But if it's not such a deep wisdom, like did it ever happen to you that someone's explaining something and you understand what they're saying and they give you a mashal? Then they give you another mashal and a third mashal. You think, I'm not a little baby. I got it the first time. I know what you're saying. In fact, you didn't even need a mashal in the first place. It's a very simple thing. So when you give a mashal to something that doesn't need a mashal, it's actually interfering and disturbing. So that's why in those generations they needed a mashal. In the later generations there was no mashalim. So the mashalim we give are just mashalim that help a little bit understand. There's a little bit of a comparison, but it's not like these mashalim that they contain in them the entire wisdom of the Rav, of the teacher. Okay, we'll stop here. To be continued.
Yeah.
What page is on? We finished and we're on the bottom of page 124.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Yeah, thank you.
הרב,
Yes.
אתמול מישהי אמרה לי שאסור לצאת מהבית בבוקר לפני שאומרים ברכות השחר, זה נכון? אתמול מישהי אמרה לי שאסור לצאת מהבית בבוקר לפני שאומרים ברכות השחר.
Let me rephrase. I said anyways. Anyways is not accurate. In addition to this, that you're not allowed to make a dough because it's kneading, it also, the flour happens to be muktzah. But muktzah is anything that you can't have any use, and it has no function, no use in Shabbos, becomes muktzah because you can't make a dough, so the flour is muktzah. I'm saying, if you want to, like, they're saying, oh, you can't make a dough on Shabbos. It's a malacha. Flour and water together is you can't do that. Flour is muktzah. Yeah, flour is muktzah because you can't make the dough. Now, this obviously applies to many other situations. Many times you have to make baby cereal for the infants, and you have to mix the whatever, the flour, whatever it's called, different,
Powder.
the powder, the formula, right? The formula with the liquid, and you mix it together for the baby, and